thank you first for letting me come here and possibly preach to the unconverted. I'm a fish biologist. You may ask, what's that got to do with ecosystem restoration? I actually spend the majority of my time doing riparian land management. And that I guess that highlights the intrinsic link between the ecosystem and fish. If they don't have the habitat, you don't have the fish, and they're very good indicator species, and we've been working on that concept for a few years now. So today what I'm going to talk about is the dewfish demonstration reach, which was a broad-scale demonstration project to the general populace of the public that we can actually improve the aquatic health, the aquatic ecosystem, and use fish as an indicator species to demonstrate that that's actually happening. Inland native fish are have been declining across Australia for a huge number of reasons. Primarily these have been driven by anthropogenic impacts, land clearing, water extraction. There's a whole range of factors. But what a lot of these have in common is they're actually taking away the habitat for these fish. And without the habitat, you don't have the fish. Like all other restoration systems, working on rivers is extremely complex and difficult. We go through the typical climatic conditions, decade-long drought, no water, no fish, no habitat, and we have to rebuild back from that. And that happens naturally, but because of these human-based impacts, that's not happening how it should and in the areas that it should be occurring. And the other thing to take into consideration is, and I'm sure most of you are aware of this, there's a long biological response time to many intervention activities. Some of the larger fish species, they might grow to be 20, 30, 40 years old, so their generation time span's quite long. Smaller fish species, you'll see a response reasonably quickly because they can have a couple of spawning events each year. Now, there's been a lot of fish surveys done across inland Queensland, and in particular the Condamine catchment. It's an area that's now become a focus for coal seam gas, so there is a lot of historical data in this particular field. And all of these surveys have indicated that the native species abundance and diversity has decreased significantly. Now, the local community is aware of this, and they're not very happy about it, so they're a strong driving force for this particular program. And they are one of the key reasons why this project actually initiated. Based on all the historic data, we've managed to identify some of the key threats that are out there, and we started forming a process where we can, a program where we could address these in a systematic and strategic manner. So we actually established a dewfish demonstration reach in 2007. Well, it started out as a 28-kilometre stretch of waterway around Dalby, which is about 3 hours west of Brisbane. Over the last 9 years, community response has been so favourable and the demand has been so strong, we've actually expanded that now to 110 kilometres. So we've trebled the area we have to cover with about the same amount of resources. And as I said, this is all driven by the community. It's actually fun. Initially, seed funding was from the Murray-Darling Basin Commission. They set up 7 demonstration reaches around Australia to show to the community that active intervention can pay long-term dividends. Now, the purpose of the demonstration reach, as its name says, is to demonstrate exactly that to the community, that we can have an impact and that each individual person can have a tangible impact on the aquatic ecosystem. More specifically, we start looking at restoring native fish populations to 60% of pre-European levels. Across the whole Murray-Darling Basin, going back about 12 years ago now, it was estimated that fish populations were around 10% of pre-European settlement. Our goal is to get it up to 60% because we can't mitigate all of the threats and impacts, but we can get rid of most of them. What we're hoping for is once we get to a certain base level, it'll continue to improve by itself. And of course, below this, there's a whole heap of very specific or task-specific objectives that we use to run the program, but also how to monitor it. When we set up this program, we didn't actually even know about the process for developing the national restoration standards. However, we followed the same key principles, and I believe they're essential for a successful program. Now, we used the extensive baseline surveys to document what the current status was, then identify the key threats. If we don't know what's there and what's actually impacting them, how can we actually try to improve those populations? Now, being a scientist, we took a very scientific approach. We used what's called an MBARCI model, so multiple before, after, reference, control, intervention. What this means is that you've actually got sites that are pristine, So that's your reference site, and that's what they refer to in the national standard. That's your goal, that's what you aspire to achieve. Then you've got a control site and an intervention site. And similar to what Ziggy was just saying, at one of those sites, intervention site, you actually do something. At the control site, you don't do anything. Now what this tells you is, are you getting local or widespread impacts from your interventions? And it takes out a lot of the climate variability. It's extremely difficult in inland waterways to identify a reference site. They just don't exist. We did manage to find a few that were almost pristine, and they were tucked away in state forests. But long-term land management practices have generally led to quite a number of threats. One of the other key things that I do really want to emphasise is that we put in place a very strong and structured monitoring program. Now, without this monitoring program, we wouldn't have got the results that we got today, because we feed that back into the management model. We monitor both the fish population, we monitor the in-stream habitat, and we also monitor the riparian condition. And there are still a lot of knowledge gaps in inland fisheries management, and for that reason we actually conducted specific research projects on these knowledge gaps where we needed them. And again, that fits in with the national strategy of linking practice and science. So to make all this work, we had to couch this in a very flexible adaptive management strategy or adaptive management model. And this was informed twice yearly through our monitoring reports. And this was one of the biggest things, or biggest reasons why this program was a success, because we could early on identify what was working, what wasn't, but also identify key areas where we could actually get a better bang for our buck, to use that term. So this also allowed us to deliver ongoing restoration under a very uncertain funding cycle. We were getting between 1 year and 3 year funding, yet we were looking at a 20-year project. But the management model allowed us to work through those scenarios. It also allowed us to give tangible evidence to the community that what they're doing and what we're doing is actually paying dividends and is worthwhile. And that was a really key thing. The community need to know that what they're doing is working, or if it's not working, why isn't it working? Without that knowledge, they'll disengage, and then it'll be very hard to run such a project. So now I'm just going to quickly go through 2 brief case studies within the demonstration reach of different approaches that we used. So the first one's Okie Creek, which was a highly modified creek. It now has all the town water from Toowoomba. That's all run through there. Traditionally, that didn't run into that catchment in the same manner. And again, surveys indicated that the native fish abundance was low, but particularly the diversity was low. And the key thing that we've come up with this is it's a lack of habitat, and particularly in-stream habitat. The riparian zone's degraded, it's narrow, so it's not naturally providing those ecosystem functions that it needs to. There are also numerous barriers to fish passage, so if something does go wrong in one part of the river, you don't get your recolonisation or migration. We used a variety of approaches to actually improve the structural complexity within the stream bed. Now, anything that we were doing was only going to be a short-term stopgap while we looked at the larger catchment management. What we were trying to do was re-establish the riparian vegetation so it can deliver that habitat naturally, but in the meantime, we've actually got to support the existing fish population. So initially, we focused on resnagging using whole trees and complex log jams, which is just a pile of branches and trees shoved together. Now, that's sort of quite traditional approach, so that's a log jam there. But the cost of transporting an entire tree on a flatbed truck is almost prohibitively expensive. So we started thinking, well, what can we do as a surrogate for that sort of habitat? We started building fish hotels and using concrete pipes for breeding. Now, these fish hotels were recycled railway timber, all tested to make sure that they weren't toxic. They end up weighing 2 to 4 tonnes, so they're quite significant. But they did not move in those 10, 11 floods when they had about 10 metres of water go over them. So that was one of the big things. Can you put in something temporary that won't move so that councils aren't concerned about their infrastructure? As I said, we've also been working extensively on the riparian zone because that's what's going to perpetuate the supply of habitat in the river. Just the usual ones, stock exclusion, replanting, off-stream watering, and in particular in some locations, crowd management or people management, because people were trampling the banks to death. So how did this all go? It actually went fantastically. for some species. The abundance of the larger native species improved out of sight. You know, there was between a 5 and 10-fold increase in all the large native species. And this was pretty much from within 6 months of the habitat being installed and ongoing. It's actually still going up now, even though I haven't got the data on that graph. So large-scale habitat, large-scale fish. Interestingly, we used fish and angling in particular as a lure to engage with the community. No pun meant there. Murray cod and golden perch are now consistently caught by anglers. That makes news in the newspaper. They ask, why has the fishing gone up? We talk about the project. Tackle sales and so forth have gone up in the local community. That's also driving further discussion. However, we're not seeing a lot of recruitment from the larger fish. Now, there could be two reasons for this. One is it's not occurring where we're actually sampling, which is possible because fish often move large distances before they spawn, or alternatively, it's not occurring. Now, if it's not occurring and anglers are harvesting more, it's something we need to be concerned of. So we've actually set up some research sites outside of areas where people can catch fish just to investigate that action. But what this highlights is that we actually need to address the habitat for all different life stages in animals. Juvenile fish have a very different habitat requirement than adult fish, and there's a linkage between them. With barriers to migration, you don't get that linkage. You don't address all of those, you can't actually improve the entire fish or the aquatic community in the whole ecosystem. Interestingly, the constructed habitats, so the fish hotels, held similar fish assemblages to the natural timber. And the more complex we made those the fish hotels, the larger the number of fish that it held, but also the greater size range of fish it held. So simple structures weren't working, larger structures working, and we're now at the point of how much and how many clusters do we need to have the best benefit. So the second site I'm going to talk to you about is actually a semi-urban site. It's very, very different. This creek runs through the middle of Dalby town. It's got a weir on one end. It's about a 3 kilometre long pool. At the start of the project, it was in extremely poor condition. Water quality was horrible. Riparian zones extremely limited due to urban encroachment, and the fish community was suffering consequently. This is a very visual site being in the heart of town, so it's actually got a lot of comment. And because we worked primarily on riparian management, it's also a very visual site. So following the baseline surveys, we identified what we could do and then went about doing it. This was one where it was so degraded we had to consider reconstruction. We thought that that was the only way we were going to rebuild the ecosystem. As it turns out, that changed throughout the project. We started again with large-scale habitat enhancement. It's an easier one to get funding for, but also sedimentation was a big issue in this particular waterway. We resnagged, we added a lunker, which is an artificial undercut bank, simulates root-bound banks, very common habitat that's preferred by fish. We managed the pest species, we removed the sediment, and we added some large boulders for complexity. Again, we initially saw a good response from the large species. Problem this time is, it's an urban waterway and we have pollution issues. They have blackwater events, which actually send in large amounts of organic debris after a rainfall event, sucks all the oxygen out of the water as it breaks down, and that kills all your fish. So yes, we got some initial improvements, but we had multiple fish kills. We also had a massive record level flood pass through, which drowned half the town. That led to some strange things turning up in the waterway. But what we noticed was, and we're looking at ecosystem restoration here, or at least rehabilitation, is that the small native fish weren't responding to any of those activities. Again, this comes down to a habitat issue, but because they have a different habitat requirement to the large fish, we hadn't actually addressed that yet. The bankside habitat and in-stream aquatic vegetation is key to many of these small species. They use it for shelter, they use it for food, they also use it to spawn on. So without the vegetation, you're not going to get your diversity, and a couple of key species were actually missing from this stretch of water. So we took a two-pronged approach to this. Firstly, we thought about a replanting program. We actually worked in conjunction with the local school group there. They propagated a whole heap of native indigenous plants to that region, and then after a 12-month period, they planted those. We also took another approach where we tried to work on land management practices with the local council. And so we set up a bankside buffer program, and that's turned out to be an absolute goldmine. So what I mean by bankside buffer program, we're in a very urbanised area. What we did was just we asked them not to mow within 1 metre of the water's edge. So this is saving them labour, it's saving them occupational health and safety issues, and it's saving them money. But for us, it's actually allowing the natural vegetation to come back. Now, we thought we'd have to replant a lot of this vegetation. That wasn't the case. There was still enough seed bank left that it naturally regenerated. And it has responded so well that some of the habitat values now approach the pristine reference sites. I'll show you some photos in a minute, but it was mind-blowing. Almost to the point we didn't need the replanting program. But we'd already gone through it with the school, so we found a stretch that was still needed a bit, and we went ahead and planted anyway. And that has worked out really well as well. One of the other interesting things is just the mowing practice of leaving 1 metre on the bankside, 10-fold increase in native tree regeneration. They were knocking down all the gum saplings and disturbing the water so much just by mowing to the edge. So you can make big changes with very little effort. So that's what we started with. That's about knee deep across most of that. That's what we've finished with. That's the bankside buffer. We had major erosion issues. Add the vegetation, bankside buffer, don't mow right to the edge, not quite a metre there. We've got rid of that erosion. Again, that bankside buffer is now also catching all the sediment running off that flat there. And the community actually think that's aesthetically very appealing. It took us a while to convince them. They were worried about snakes and a whole range of other things, but now they're happy and they're proud of that. So the student planting, we looked at that far bank up there. Started out, this is 2 weeks after planting. That's what it ended up 6 weeks after planting. That's what it now looks like. That has now survived several minor level floods and stayed in place and has spread elsewhere in the creek. There are a couple of species we planted that hadn't recurred naturally. So what does this mean for the fish and the native fish population in particular? Huge increases in some of the species. 237-fold improvement in carp gudgeon, which are a key indicator species that rely on aquatic vegetation. If you look at the graph here, this is where we started the buffer zone. For all those years, nothing, boom. There's a bit of seasonal variation in fish species, and same with all the other species. Here's where we put the buffer zone in. They've all gone up. And now we're seeing a lot of extra recruitment as well. So the populations and the fish assemblage is actually naturally rehabilitating itself. So key lessons learned from this. As I stated at the start, the principles guiding those national standards are actually a very good logical framework for any ecological restoration project. They give you the key things to think about and deal with at the start, rather than getting halfway through and going, oh, I forgot about that. It's extremely vital to set a whole range of targets at different levels, from your strategic right through to your on-ground implementation. That gives you something you can measure your performance against, and also gives you the opportunity to say, well, that didn't work, why? And that ties into the next point, which is monitoring is, particularly in the freshwater system, is extremely important. Without that feedback loop going into the adaptive management model and giving that information back to the community, you actually disengage them. It's just happening, it's out of sight, no one can see fish. Anglers get an increase in catch, but that's about it. We're talking small fish this big. Most of the community can't see that. But if we tell them the results, we present to them, we engage with them, we work a lot with school groups, we get fantastic response from them. And what that means is that when our funding runs out, they continue to do that work. So you're getting that long-term continuation. And as I said at the start, biological responses can take a long time. For the small fish, we saw an almost instantaneous response, but for the largest fish, particularly those that breed only on certain flow conditions, that can be 5 or 10 years in between spawning events. So it needs to be monitored in the longer term if you want to really realise the benefits from what's happened. And as I've just said, community engagement is probably your second most priority in this. Without the community, it doesn't happen. But the community are also quite interested when you bring it down to a personal level. And when you teach through skids, when you teach the kids, they actually pass the message on through the parents, and then the parents start discussing it amongst themselves. And that actually propagates out, and that's a very, very effective form of extension. And hopefully this project continues without us into the future. So, thank you.